Hello everyone. I'm going to be recording a brief presentation on some plagiarism best practices. And what I mean is not how to plagiarize, but of course how to avoid plagiarism in academic writing. And this presentation is of course very suitable for your baccalaureate program, but if you ever go back to school for your master's or a doctoral degree, then you definitely need to follow these best practices as well. So I'm going to move myself over to the side and go over a few things in which I will show you some wrong ways to do things as well as the correct way to cite direct quotes. We'll also look at how to properly paraphrase in your own words information that you receive from another source and how to cite that because we have to cite it. And then some rules of thumb of how many direct word for word quotes should I include in papers of various sizes. So with that being said, let's get started. So avoiding plagiarism in academic writing. This is discussion boards, formal papers, informal papers, whatever you're turning in academia as a student, it needs to be, all of your sources need to be attributed properly so that you are not plagiarizing. So let's talk about what is plagiarism. Note that I specifically made every attempt not to plagiarize while doing a presentation on plagiarism. Therefore, you will see that I have started the first body slide correctly citing something. So according to the American Psychological Association, or APA, plagiarism is the act of presenting your words, ideas, or images of another as your own. And note that it is not the same thing as using your own words or experiences, telling your own stories and your own self-reflection. That's you. That's your thoughts. You didn't take that from someone else or borrow from someone else's ideas. So of course, that's not plagiarized. Likewise, common knowledge is not considered plagiarism. So what is common knowledge? In nursing, common knowledge is something as simple as vital signs typically consist of a blood pressure, pulse, temperature, respiration. Sometimes a pain rating is included, sometimes oxygen saturation. So if I said that in my paper, that's common knowledge to anyone affiliated with nursing school. So I don't need to have a source to back that up because that's just, we know that. And then you'll see I cited this correctly. Now, how do I know that I cited this correctly? We're going to get into that. The do's and the don'ts of proper citation within your paper. So let's talk about the main types of plagiarism and kind of shed a little light on the first bullet point, deliberate versus unintentional. Most of the time when a student gets a comment from a faculty that something has been plagiarized, it was a completely unintentional thing on the part of the student. However, there are deliberate attempts at plagiarism that can be multiple different forms. Sometimes it's considered self-plagiarism, where a paper that I wrote that I've already turned in for a grade in a different class, I recycle and I turn the exact same thing in for a later class. That is plagiarism because you've already turned that work in. Even though you wrote it, it's still considered self-plagiarism. And I didn't really go into that in this presentation, but there's a big section on self-plagiarism in the APA publication manual. So you need to check that out if you were not already aware that that is considered plagiarism and it's very, very not okay. Also, sometimes people pay other people to write their papers for them. They either buy sources that are available online, or they get their BFF who's a really good writer to write things for them. That's also plagiarism because it's not your work, it's someone else's work, and you're not correctly attributing that to someone else. You're passing it off as your own words, so therefore it is plagiarism. All of those examples would be instances in which the academic integrity policy of the university is not being upheld. Those are kind of obvious. We know that. Or if I just decide that I find this really cool website or this really good journal article and I just copy huge chunks of it and I paste it in my paper and move on as if that is my own words. That is deliberate plagiarism. For the most part, in my many years of teaching, I have seen some of that. That has definitely come across my desk. But for the most part, what we see is unintentional plagiarism, where a student is trying their best to properly attribute their source to the information in their paper. However, for some reason something is incomplete or not done properly, and therefore it is technically considered plagiarism. So the APA, in fact, says whether deliberate or unintentional, plagiarism violates ethical standards in scholarship, and therefore we have to avoid it at all costs. That's pretty standard no matter where you go to school. So the other two main types of plagiarism I'm going to talk about in the rest of this presentation is word for word and paraphrasing plagiarism. I'm going to spend more time on the word for word plagiarism because that tends to be what I see most students struggle with in any of the classes I've ever taught. So we're going to kind of break this down, and I'm going to show you what it's supposed to look like and, of course, what it's not supposed to look like. So first of all, what is word for word plagiarism? Well, I actually got this information from Indiana University. They have a really fantastic free certification or tutorial program that anyone can go through, in which it shows you varying levels of, starts at novice, beginner, and then goes all the way up to expert, and being able to recognize and to avoid various levels and types of plagiarism. And so according to their site, what would be word for word plagiarism is if you use 7 or more words in sequence from an original source while missing one or more of the following elements that are required in your citation. First of all, if you fail to offset the quoted direct word for word quoted information inside opening and closing parentheses, so the double parenthesis, not the single like apostrophe, then that would be considered plagiarism. Because without having those quotation marks, you're telling the reader those are my words, and they're not. So that's considered plagiarism. Whether you meant to do that or not, by leaving those quotation marks out, you've just plagiarized because you've passed someone's exact words off as your own. Another element, let's say, okay, well, I put it inside quotation marks. If you are missing any one or more of the 3 things in the bolded bullet point, then you have also plagiarized because you have not properly cited. There are 3 things that have to be included in the text, in the in-text citation for a direct quote. First, the authors of the work, whether that's one person, two people, or whether it's the first author at all, whether that's an organization as author, such as the Centers for Disease Control or the National Institutes of Health, United States Preventative Services Task Force. All of those could be authors of your work. So that is going to be one of the 3 required elements. You can either include that as part of your sentence, which I have examples of later, or it can be offset inside a parenthetical citation. And all a parenthetical citation is just a citation that's not part of a sentence. It's appended to the sentence inside parentheses, opening and closing parentheses. So authors, whether that's an individual, more than one individual, or an organization. The publication date has to be here for a direct quote. So that's the date that this was published, either in a textbook, online, or in a journal article, etc. And then lastly, the one that most people miss is the source location. If the source you're using has dedicated page numbers, such as a textbook, and you flip to page 180, then anybody could open that book and find page 180 really easily. A journal article that is numbered with page numbers, then I could flip to page 1252 and find exactly where the quote is that you are referring to. However, some things are not paginated, or they don't have inherent page numbers attached to them. Frequently, this is going to be things like a website. So let's say I'm looking at the CDC's website at some data on their morbidity and mortality rates related to pediatric asthma. And of course, I'm just looking at a website, so there's no numbers. What I could do is, if it's the second paragraph is where I'm taking the information, I can cite paragraph number 2 as my source location. Or let's say I'm looking in the subsection that says signs and symptoms, I can put signs and symptoms section. So all of that is readily available for you in the APA manual. It shows you how to do all of the source locations when you have a work that does not have page numbers attached to them. However, for the most part, we can pretty well use either page number, paragraph number, or section heading for any kind of source we're mostly going to use in this class. And then lastly, but still very importantly, the work that you are citing also has to appear in the reference list at the end of your writing. Anything that is cited in text, except for a few caveats like a personal communication, like an interview or something, you have to include in the reference list. So if any of that is missing, you have plagiarized. It is considered word for word plagiarism. So here's an example. I actually pulled some articles that I have read recently and kind of took snapshots of them and also gave you the reference for them. On the left side is what you, the student, are looking at. This is the article, and then this is the reference citation for this. So here's an example of what I would do if I were trying to use this and I plagiarized. Note that plagiarism does not always mean copying everything exactly word for word for word. I somewhat did that, but I purposely used my first example to show you how this can get you. You think you're being tricky and removing a few words, so I didn't plagiarize, but technically you did, because we strung together words that were not our own and tried to pass it off as our own. So you can pause if you want to compare the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. So why is this plagiarism? First of all, there's not a single citation anywhere here. I didn't even give you the author and the date. So this is basically the reader is telling the reader that all of these words are mine, and that's absolutely not true. These words came from this source. So I have absolutely messed up the whole shebang because I haven't given you any information. So here is the exact same example, but this is what some students would do in this situation. So they cited this with the first author et al. 2020, which is the publication date. There's no quotation marks. There's no page number. So as a reader, I'm to assume that you paraphrase this and change this substantially to put it in your own words and that it shouldn't match the original source. However, when we compare A and B, they're almost exactly the same. There's just a few little words here and there that are different. That is a big no-no. Students like to do that a lot. They think if I take a sentence that has 20 words and I take the word the out or I add an extra word here and there, that's not a direct quote. But it is, because you have used other people's words and you're passing them off as your own. You'll have to learn how to be better adept at paraphrasing, putting things into your own words. And that is a skill that students struggle with. And so I'm trying to give you some resources to help you be better at that. So can I use this? Absolutely. This is what this would look like. Note that I took two sentences and I kind of strung them together. But what I did is I put them inside opening and closing quotation marks. I let the reader know that I did not put this whole sentence in here. I took part of it and then I added a word that was my own to make it make sense. So I put it inside these brackets and then I closed the quotation marks and I have all three elements in my parenthetical citation. Author, date, page number. That's the source locator. So that checks. This is not plagiarism. Okay, so that is a word for word quote that was properly handled with all of the components necessary so that I don't get in trouble for plagiarizing. Here's another example. This one was from an article that I looked at related to COVID and burnout within the workplace secondary to COVID. So you can see I highlighted the first sentence because I thought, well, that sounds good. So I copied and pasted it directly into my paper and I did cite it. So I gave you the authors and I gave you the year. The problem is I'm missing very important information here. First of all, I'm missing the source locator in the parenthetical citation. I would have needed to said what page or paragraph this came from. But more importantly, I also didn't put my opening quotation mark and my closing quotation mark. When you don't put your quotation marks, you're telling your reader, these are my own words. Basically how this is written on the slide is I'm telling the reader that I used concepts and thoughts from the Magna Vita et al. Source, but I changed the words completely to put them in my own words, but I still used ideas from that source. So I want to give you a heads up on that. But that's not what you did. You copied the exact sentence verbatim and did not properly cite it. So here's another example of how a lot of students will do this. Note the only difference between the prior screen and this one is that I did include the quotation marks. So I have now told you that this whole sentence is not my own words. I got this from this source. But what's missing? I don't have a source locator. So check, I have opening and closing quotes. Check, I have the author. Check, I have the publication year, but there's no page, paragraph, section heading, any of that. So this is incomplete and it's therefore plagiarized. You have to have all of that or you are plagiarizing. Every single instance that happens in your paper is plagiarized. And that's a massive issue because you need to know how to properly attribute your sources. So this is what it should look like. I have opening quotes. I have closing quotes. You have to have both. If you just open quotes and you never close your quotes, you've missed a step. It's plagiarized. I have authors, I have year, and I have the source location. And this one, this article is not paginated. It's an online article only. But this came directly from the first paragraph, so I said that with para, period, 1. So anyone could go find this article, they could turn to the first paragraph, and they would be able to find this quote verbatim right there. And so that's how you should document your sources. So we don't want to use a whole lot of these word-for-word quotations. Some students have even turned in papers that almost a third or well over half of the information in their paper is not even their own words. It's someone else's that they've copied and pasted sporadically into a paper, and that's not going to cut it because these papers are about how well do I understand the course content and I can articulate that to meet the objectives of the course. And you can't do that if you are just copying and pasting other people's words into a paper and turning it in and expecting to demonstrate understanding. That's not going to work. So I have another source here that I have used in a recent publication I'm working on. And so you can see that I have completely paraphrased this. None of this comes from this source. You can use like a couple words. I mean, and individuals, but that's not plagiarized because it's just a couple of words. But I took the thoughts and the main ideas from here and I put it into my own words to say, an individual's personality can influence them in multiple different ways, including the way they respond to and communicate with others. But because I used a source to help develop that thought in my paper, I need to attribute that source. So I put the authors and I put the date. Okay. Note that you don't have to put a page number here. Although APA says if you want, you can put page numbers. In fact, some people just like to get in the habit of putting page numbers for every single citation they do. And if you do that, that's okay. That's perfectly acceptable according to the 7th edition APA manual. However, it's not required unless you are documenting a verbatim word-for-word quote from your source. Here's another example. So here is a snapshot of the primary source that I used to develop this idea as well as its reference citation. And so I put Reese and Prestel noted that employees' self-assessed levels of perfectionism correlated to their levels of work-related strain. This finding stands in contrast to a typical workplace tenet that perfectionist employees are high-performing employees. So those are my own words. I kind of synthesized or summarized what I read from multiple paragraphs in this source and put it into a couple of sentences. So that would be paraphrased. I don't have to use quotation marks or page numbers because it's my own words, but I still used that source to develop these ideas in my paper. So the rule of thumb is that you should barely ever use direct quotes, word for word quotes. The best time to do it I have on the next slide. However, using too many direct word-for-word quotes throughout your paper makes your paper choppy because here's my writing and then bam, I put somebody else's thought here and it doesn't merge and flow well. And then I go back to my thoughts and then I put someone else's thoughts. And it's like a ping pong match and nothing flows and the reader doesn't understand the gist of what you're trying to tell them. So putting others' thoughts and writing into your own words helps the content flow seamlessly from start to finish, so that you don't have that choppy whiplash of my thoughts, your thoughts, my thoughts. It's best to flow if you put everything in your own words. Are there times when it's acceptable or even preferred to use a direct quote? And the answer is yes. Typically, if you are providing a very specific definition using the verbiage from an original source, and you think that that's going to convey the idea better than if you try to put it into your own words, then that's a good time to use a direct quote. You would want to make sure that you would offset that in quotation marks and use your 3 elements in your parenthetical citation. Also, if the wording is very unique or specific and it holds some significance that you want to include in your paper, that also is an acceptable time to use a direct quote, making sure that you properly cite it with all of the elements that I previously talked about. So a rule of thumb, because sometimes students ask this, and honestly, the APA manual is very vague when it comes to this. They say that you should barely use direct quotes, but they don't give you a good rule of thumb. However, based on best practices in academia and in publication world, no more than 5% of your paper that you're trying to turn in should be directly quoted information from another source. So for example, I broke this down for you. If you're doing an online discussion forum and the word limit or word count is about 500 words, then 5% of that is 25 words. So that equates to, in your whole discussion forum response, you can only have one word for word quote that's about 25 words. Otherwise, everything else needs to be paraphrased in your own words and not quote, 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 quote. If you continue to do that, that is sloppy, it's lazy, and it's not good academic writing. We don't want to promote that. So you need to get in the habit of barely, if ever, using direct quotes and putting things into your own words, because that is a sign that you understand the content and you understand what you're reading in such a way that you can convey that in your own words. For a longer, more formal paper, not a discussion forum, but something more formal, say 1,000-word paper, then this would equate to 50 words. So that would be equivalent to brief word-for-word quotes throughout the entire paper, no more than that. Everything else needs to be paraphrased or your own unique thoughts or ideas. Also, always make sure that you are appropriately citing even paraphrased information. You have to cite. You have to have author and year. You don't have to have the page number unless you are putting something direct word for word. So these are expectations that we expect you to follow. You should not be using any more than these numbers of quotes. You should very rarely, if ever, have quotes that are longer than 25-ish words. Okay, APA in fact says that any quote that is 40 or more words in length is a long quote, and it must be formatted in a very specific way called a block quote. You should avoid those at all cost. It's imperative that you make these papers and your assignments your own words. Paraphrase, of course. Cite, always. If you do these and you follow these steps, then you're not going to be plagiarizing in your papers, and it's going to be a much better product that demonstrates your ability to meet the course objectives and successfully complete the course. I hope this has helped. As always, for any APA questions, always consult your APA publication manual, the 7th edition, which is the most recent edition, and that will have all of the rules that I don't have time to talk about in this presentation. Thanks for watching.